Whatever Mr. Wrong did was absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. However hard he tried, he just couldn't do anything right. Just look at his house. One fine morning, Mr. Wrong woke up. He hadn't slept very well because of the way he'd made his bed the day before. He jumped out of bed, fell over, twice, put on his shoes, on the wrong feet, went to the bathroom, tripping over the bath mat, squeezed out some toothpaste onto the wrong side of his toothbrush, cleaned his teeth, and went downstairs. Bump, 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 bump. Not a very good start to the day. In fact, his usual wrong start to the day. In his kitchen, Mr. Wrong poured some milk onto his cornflakes and missed. As he sat in his kitchen that fine morning, eating his dry cornflakes, he sighed. Oh dear, he thought. I do so wish that everything I do wasn't quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. So after breakfast, he went for a walk in order to think how he could solve his problem. It took him 10 minutes to get out of the house, because he kept trying to open his front door outwards instead of inwards. As he walked along, he passed a worm. "Morning, dog," he said. The worm grinned. He was used to Mr. Wrong. He met a postman. "Morning, Mr. Wrong," called the postman cheerfully. "Morning, doctor," replied Mr. Wrong. Oh, dear. He met Earl and Mrs. Twinkle, who lived down the lane. "Good morning, Mr. Wrong," she smiled. "Morning, Mr. Twinkle," replied Mr. Wrong. Oh, dear. And then he met somebody he'd never met before. Somebody who sort of looked like him, but didn't. "Good morning, sir," said that somebody. "Good morning, madam," replied Mr. Wrong. "I'm Mr. Wrong." "I guessed that," replied the person. "Well, I'm Mr. Right. Now tell me," he went on, why are you walking along looking so miserable?" "Because," replied Mr. Wrong, "I can't do anything right." "In which case," said Mr. Right, "we'd better do something about it. Follow me." And off he set, and off set Mr. Wrong, in the opposite direction. Mr. Right hurried back and turned him round. "This way," he said. And they walked together to where Mr. Right lived. It was a house which somehow looked something like where Mr. Wrong lived, but different. Mr. Right took Mr. Wrong into his living room. "I think," he said, "that the only way you're ever going to change is for you to come and live with me for a while. And you may end up by being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong about everything. Sit down," he said, "and we'll talk about it." Mr. Wrong sat down and missed. Mr. Wrong stayed with Mr. Right for a month, and during that time he changed. After 1 week he was slightly less wrong than he had been before. After 2 weeks he was even more slightly less wrong than he had been before. And after a whole 4 weeks he was a changed Mr. Man. You could hardly tell the difference between him and Mr. Right. Don't you agree? Mr. Right was delighted. "Told you," he cried. "Told you that everything about you might end up by being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. In fact," he continued, "you've really turned out all right." Mr. Wrong blushed. It was quite the nicest thing anyone had ever said to him in the whole of his life. And he went home and lived happily and right ever after. Now, you probably think that that's the end of the story, don't you? But it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because of what happened to Mr. Wright. The trouble was, you see, that the longer Mr. Wrong had stayed with Mr. Wright, and the more right Mr. Wrong became, the more wrong Mr. Wright had become. Isn't that extraordinary? Oh, dear, he sighed. My plan didn't quite work out the way I'd planned it after all. And he went to bed in the bath.